My name is Hadley Pierce, and the year I learned what my family really thought of me, I was 11 years old. Not 12, not 13. 11. People always round up when I tell this story, like an extra year would somehow make it less ugly. It wouldn't. It was a Tuesday in late June, the kind of Connecticut summer day where the air sits on your skin like a wet towel. I came home from a sleepover at my friend Tabitha's house expecting nothing in particular. Maybe lunch. Maybe my mother yelling at my brother to take out the trash. Instead, I found a manila envelope on the kitchen counter with my name on it, written in my dad's handwriting, the kind he used for grocery lists. Inside was $300 in 20s, a key to our neighbor Mrs. Hollenbeck's back door, and a single sheet of yellow legal paper. Hadley, we're in Myrtle Beach until August. Mrs. H said you can stay there if it gets weird. There's stuff in the freezer. Don't call on someone's bleeding. That was it. No goodbye. No I love you. No mention of my birthday, which was in 11 days. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up. I remember the way the sun came through the window over the sink and made a perfect rectangle on the floor, and how I stared at it until my eyes burned, because I knew if I looked anywhere else, I was going to start crying, and once I started, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop. My older brother, Bennett, had just turned 16. He was the golden boy, lacrosse captain, honor roll, the whole package. My younger sister, Marigold. Yes, that was her real name. My mother had a thing for flowers, was 8, and she was the baby. The cute one. The one who got birthday parties at the trampoline park with 20 kids and a custom cake shaped like a unicorn. Me? I was the middle. The one who didn't need things. The one who could stay home alone for 2 months at 11 years old, apparently, while everyone else went to a beach house in South Carolina. Bennett posted a photo on Instagram that night. He was holding up a fishing rod, grinning with my dad's arm around his shoulder. The caption said, "Summer with the fam." Marigold commented with 3 pink heart emojis. I didn't have a phone yet. I had to see it on my mom's old laptop, which she'd left charging on the dining room table. I sat there in the dark and looked at that photo for what felt like an hour. I tried to find myself in the background, like maybe they'd just forgotten to tag me. They hadn't forgotten. I just wasn't there. The first 3 days, I told myself it was a misunderstanding. I made grilled cheese for dinner and watched reruns of Friends on the couch and waited for my mom to call. She didn't. On day 4, I walked over to Mrs. Hollenbeck's because I'd run out of bread, and she gave me a strange, soft look that I now recognize as pity. She made me a real meal. Pot roast. I hadn't had pot roast since my grandma died. By day 6, I'd stopped expecting the phone to ring. I'd started understanding what had happened. They hadn't accidentally left me. They'd chosen to. That was the day my Uncle Theo showed up. I was sitting on the front porch, reading a beat-up copy of A Wrinkle in Time I'd found in the basement, trying very hard to look like a girl who was fine, when a silver SUV pulled into our driveway. The man who got out was tall and gray at the temples, wearing the kind of expensive watch that doesn't shine, just glows quietly. He had my mother's nose. "Hadley," he said. "You probably don't remember me. I'm your uncle, Theo Pierce." I did remember him, sort of. There was a Christmas card on our fridge once with his name on it. My mom had thrown it out without opening it. She used to call him her insufferable brother, which I now know meant the one who saw through her. He'd stopped coming around when I was 4 or 5. Some falling out about my grandfather's estate that nobody wanted to explain to a child. "Where are your folks?" he asked. "Myrtle Beach." "And you're here because they didn't take me." He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stood there in his pressed khakis and his quiet watch, and then he sat down on the porch step beside me without asking. His knees popped a little when he did. He smelled like cedar and coffee. "How long?" he finally said. 6 days. They'll be back in August, I think." In August. He said it the way you'd say cancer. Like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. I told him about the envelope, about Mrs. Hollenbeck, about the $300, which I hadn't touched because I was afraid of needing it later. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and his jaw kept getting tighter and tighter, like a bolt being torqued down. When I finished, he said, "Pack a bag, kiddo. I'm not supposed to leave," I said. Mom said, "Hadley." He turned and looked at me, really looked, the way nobody had looked at me in a long time. "I drove 3 hours because your principal called me. Your school had me down as a backup contact from when you were in 2nd grade. You haven't been showing up for the summer reading program. Apparently your folks didn't tell anyone where you were either. So you're going to pack a bag and you're going to come stay with me, and we are going to figure this out like grown-ups. Okay?" I nodded. I couldn't speak. "And when we get there," he added, more gently, "you can have whatever you want for dinner, within reason. I'm not buying you a steak. You're 11. I laughed, which startled me because I hadn't laughed in a week. His house was 90 minutes away, in a town outside of Hartford called Briarcliff. It was a 2-story colonial with green shutters and a magnolia tree in the front yard. The first thing I noticed when we walked in was that it was quiet, not empty quiet, lived-in quiet, like someone had figured out how to be alone without it hurting. He showed me to a guest room with sheets that smelled like lavender and a real headboard, not just a frame. I stood in the doorway like I was afraid the floor might give out. He noticed. "Sheets are sheets, Hadley. They wash. Sit down. Lay down. Build a fort. I don't care." I sat on the very edge of the bed. He raised an eyebrow. "You always sit like that? Like what? Like you're afraid the chair has feelings?" I shrugged. He shook his head and disappeared down the hall. That first night, he ordered pizza and let me pick the toppings. I asked for cheese because I was scared to ask for anything more. He looked at the menu, looked at me, and then ordered a large pepperoni, a small Hawaiian, and a Caesar salad because, he said, children should not subsist on disappointment alone. I ate 4 slices and felt guilty about every one of them. The next morning, he made a phone call. I sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, pretending to read the back of the box, but I was listening to every word. "Margaret, it's me. Yes, I know what year it is. No, I'm not calling to fight. I'm calling because your daughter is sitting at my kitchen table eating frosted mini wheats, and you, apparently, are in South Carolina. No, you don't get to interrupt me. She's 11, Margaret. 11. I'd never heard anyone say my mother's name like that, like it was a verdict. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Here's what's going to happen. I'm filing for emergency temporary guardianship on Monday morning. You can fight it, or you can sign the paperwork voluntarily, but either way, she's not going back to that house at the end of the summer. You can call it whatever you want. I'm calling it the bare minimum. Yes, I'll have my lawyer send it. Goodbye, Margaret." He hung up. He stood there for a second with his hand still on the phone. Then he turned to me and said, "How do you feel about pancakes?" I started crying. Not because I was sad, because for the first time in my life, somebody had used the word daughter about me and meant it. He filed the papers on Monday. My mother signed them on Friday. Just like that, without a fight. I think that's the part that broke me the most, looking back. She didn't even try. She didn't say, "We made a mistake, sent her home." She said, "Fine," and she sent a UPS box with my winter coat and 3 pairs of jeans, and that was that. I lived with Uncle Theo from age 11 to age 18, then through college, and in a way, I'm still living with him now, even though he's gone. He was a structural engineer. He owned a small firm that designed bridges mostly in the Northeast. He'd never married. There was a woman named Cordy who he'd been engaged to in his 30s, but she died of an aneurysm 2 weeks before the wedding, and he'd kept her photo in a drawer in his study, and a single dried sprig of baby's breath from the bouquet they never used pinned to the corkboard above his desk. I asked about her exactly once. He told me about her for 2 hours. Then he never brought her up again, but I understood why he hadn't filled the house with anyone else. Some people have one great love, and when it's gone, they don't go looking for a replacement. They just become very good at being alone. He'd been very good at being alone until I showed up. The first lesson he taught me was about the chair. I'd been there about 3 weeks, and I was still doing the thing where I sat on the edge of every piece of furniture like I was a guest at a hotel I couldn't afford. He came into the living room one night while I was perched on the loo seat, and he looked at me and he sighed. Hadley. Mira. I went over. Sit on the couch. I sat on the couch. Lean back. I leaned back. Now put your feet up. I put my feet up. There, he said. That's how you sit in a house you live in. Practice it. I practiced it. It took about a year before I stopped flinching every time I let my body relax in his furniture. He never rushed me. He just kept pointing it out. Feet up, kiddo. You live here. The second lesson was about money. He gave me a $5 a week allowance starting that fall. When I turned 12, he made me open a savings account at the credit union. When I got my first real job at 15, washing dishes at a diner called the Maple Pin, he sat me down at the kitchen table and we made a budget on graph paper. Half goes to savings, a quarter for things you need, a quarter for things you want, and don't ever confuse those last two, he said. That's how grown-ups end up broke. The third lesson was about people. There are two kinds of folks, Hadley. Folks who will take more than they give, and folks who will give more than they take. Most people are the first kind, and they don't know it about themselves, which is what makes them dangerous. Watch what they do, not what they say. And when you find the second kind, and you will, they're rarer than you think, but they exist. Keep them close. Don't let them get away. I wrote it down in a green spiral notebook he'd given me my first Christmas. He'd given me a few things that year. Not a lot. A pair of cross-country ski gloves because I told him I wanted to try the team in middle school. A book called The Phantom Toll Booth that had been his when he was a boy, with his name penciled inside the front cover. And the green notebook with a note clipped to the front that said, "For the things you don't want to forget." That was also the Christmas my mother sent, a card with a $20 Target gift card in it. The card said, "Merry Christmas from Mom, Dad, Bennett, and Marigold." There was a little reindeer on the front. The handwriting on the envelope was Marigold's. She was 9. She'd done it because someone had told her to. I knew because the card came with no return address and a smudge on the back where someone had probably tried to write something more and then changed their mind. I didn't open it for a week. When I did, I put the gift card in the back of the notebook, and I never spent it. I still have it. Somewhere. Expired by about 15 years now. Uncle Theo never said a word about my parents unless I brought them up first. He didn't badmouth them. He didn't pretend they were better than they were. He just held the space for me to figure them out on my own time. The closest he ever came to saying something cruel about them was once when I was 14, and I asked him why they hadn't even called on my birthday. He thought about it for a minute and then said, "Some people just aren't capable of seeing past their own reflection, Hadley. It's not your fault you weren't in the mirror." That's the kind of thing he said. He talked like a man who thought about every sentence before he opened his mouth. By high school, I was a different person than the one who'd been left on that porch. I was on the cross-country team. I was on the academic decathlon team. I had a best friend named Javi Mendelson, who slept over every other weekend, and Uncle Theo learned to make the kind of breakfast sandwiches that teenage girls will fight each other for. I argued with my history teacher about the Treaty of Versailles and won. I learned to drive in his old Volvo. I cried when I got into Tufts on a partial scholarship, because for 1 second I'd forgotten that wanting something didn't always mean losing it. He drove me to Boston the August I was 18, helped me carry boxes up 4 flights to my dorm. He was sweating through his shirt, and he wouldn't let me carry the heavy ones. When everything was unpacked, he stood in the middle of my tiny room and looked around and said, "Well, this is it." I was suddenly terrified. I think he could tell. "You're going to be fine," he said. "I don't know if I am." "I do." He pulled an envelope out of his back pocket. Inside was a card with a tree on the front, and inside the card, in his blocky handwriting, it said, "You were never the spare. You were always the daughter I didn't know I was waiting for. T." I cried for an hour after he left. Then I unpacked my green notebook and I wrote down what he'd told me because I didn't want to forget. College was 4 years of phone calls every Sunday at 6, every single Sunday. He never missed one, not even when he was traveling for work, not even when he had pneumonia in my junior year and was supposedly under doctor's orders to rest. Especially not then. I'd answer the phone and he'd say, "Just calling to make sure you haven't joined a cult," and I'd say, not yet. The recruitment standards are surprisingly high." And he'd laugh, and we'd talk for 45 minutes about absolutely nothing. I met Garrett Olstead my sophomore year. He was a film student from Minnesota with a quiet way about him and hands that knew how to fix things. The first time I brought him home for Thanksgiving, Uncle Theo took him into the garage to look at the snowblower, which I knew was code for "I'm going to size him up like a piece of lumber." They were out there for 40 minutes. When they came back in, Uncle Theo gave me a small nod, the kind of nod that is more meaningful than a 5-paragraph essay. Garrett looked relieved. "We've been together ever since." I graduated in May with a degree in civil engineering, the same field Uncle Theo had built his whole life on. He sat in the third row at my graduation. He stood up and clapped when they called my name, even though they told everyone not to, and the woman next to him hissed at him to sit down. He didn't sit down. After the ceremony, he hugged me and he said, "You did this. Don't let anyone tell you you didn't." I joined a small firm in New Haven, bought my first car, a used Subaru that smelled like the previous owner's golden retriever, started saving for a house. Garrett moved out to be near me. Life unspooled in a way I'd never let myself imagine when I was 11. Every Friday, Uncle Theo and I had dinner together. Sometimes he drove down, sometimes I drove up. We always picked the same Italian place halfway between our cities, a little spot called Borsetti's where the bread came out warm and the owner knew our names. That's when I started noticing. He was tired in a way that wasn't the usual end-of-the-week tired. He was leaving food on his plate at Borsetti's, which I'd never seen him do in 15 years. He held the railing on the way down to the parking lot. Once, he forgot the name of my best friend from college, and he covered for it smoothly. But I caught it. I asked him. He waved me off. "I'm 62, kiddo. The body's just doing what bodies do." Don't make a federal case of it. I should have made a federal case of it. The call came on a Wednesday morning in October. I was in a meeting. My phone buzzed and I almost didn't pick up, and then I saw it was a number I didn't recognize, and something in my chest went cold. I stepped out into the hallway. It was a nurse at Hartford Hospital. Uncle Theo had collapsed at his office. He was stable, but they were running tests. They'd called me because I was listed as his next of kin. Next of kin. That word. He'd put me down as next of kin somewhere, sometime when I wasn't looking. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I drove 90 minutes and 50. I don't know how I didn't get pulled over. When I got there, he was sitting up in the bed with one of those terrible hospital gowns on, and he looked smaller than he'd ever looked, and he tried to make a joke about the food. And I sat down in the plastic chair next to his bed and held his hand, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was 11 years old. It was his heart. Congestive heart failure, advanced. He'd known about it, it turned out, for almost a year. He hadn't told me because, he said, "I didn't want to give it real estate in your life until I had to." I yelled at him. I cried at him. He let me. When I was done, he squeezed my hand and said, "Hadley, we've got a little time. Let's not waste it being mad." We had 9 months. He kept working part-time until he couldn't. He kept coming to Borsetti's until he couldn't. He kept calling on Sundays until one Sunday he didn't, and I drove up there and found him asleep on the couch, and I stayed for the rest of the weekend, and I never went back to my apartment except to grab clothes. I moved into his house in February. Garrett came too. Garrett never once complained about it. That last Christmas, he gave me a wooden box. Inside were every birthday card he'd ever bought me, but never given me, because I was already at his house every birthday. So he hadn't needed to mail them. There were 19 of them, dated. The first one was for my 12th birthday. "Happy birthday, kiddo. Glad you're here." The last one, the one for my 30th, which was 4 months away, said, "Happy birthday, Hadley Pierce. You are the best thing I ever made room for in my life." I read all 19 and one sitting on his couch with my feet up and tears running down my face, and his old golden retriever, Otis, asleep across my lap. He sat in the armchair across from me and watched me read them and didn't say a word. He died on a Tuesday in late June, almost exactly 19 years to the day from when he'd shown up in my driveway. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. I was holding his hand. I told him I loved him. He squeezed my hand back, just barely, just enough. Then he was gone. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't have to. They found out within a week. I don't know how they always know when there's money on the line. The funeral was small. Garrett, Otis, who I think understood, some of Uncle Theo's old colleagues, a handful of people from the firm. Mrs. Hollenbeck drove all the way up from Connecticut, which I hadn't expected, and she cried more than I did. My old neighbor, the woman who had given me pot roast. And then, in the back row, in matching black coats that looked like they'd been bought that morning, were my parents and my brother and my sister. Marigold was 27 now. She was wearing a pearl necklace and her mascara was already running, performatively, before the service had even started. Bennett looked older than 35. He looked like a man who hadn't gotten what he'd been promised. My mother looked like a woman who had practiced her facial expressions in the mirror. They came up to me afterward. My mother grabbed my hands. Her own hands were cold. "Hadley, sweetheart, we had no idea he was so sick. We would have come. You didn't have any idea I existed for 19 years, I said. I said it gently. I said it without raising my voice. I don't think his health would have changed that. My father stepped in. His face was the one I remembered. The face he made when he was about to lecture someone. "Hadley, this isn't the time." "You're right," I said. "It isn't." I turned and walked away. The will reading was 11 days later. It was at a law office in West Hartford in a conference room with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. The attorney, a woman named Mavis Doherty, was someone I'd known since I was 12, because Uncle Theo had her over for dinner sometimes. She nodded at me when I walked in. She did not nod at the 4 people sitting across the table from me. My mother had brought a tissue. My father had brought his lecture face. Bennett was on his phone. Marigold had reapplied her mascara. Mavis went through the preliminaries. Debts, charitable bequests. There were several, including one to the Boys and Girls Club of Hartford that was sizable enough that my mother actually winced. Then she got to the rest of it. To my estranged sister, Margaret Pierce Holloway, and her husband Daniel, who have not contacted me or my niece in 19 years, I leave the following: a copy of the children's book, The Phantom Toll Booth, with a note from my niece. To my niece's siblings, Bennett Holloway and Marigold Holloway, I leave the same. The room got quiet. My mother's mouth opened and stayed open. To my niece, Hadley Pierce, whom I had the privilege of raising from the age of 11, I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes my home in Briarcliff, all furnishings, all liquid assets, my interest in Pierce Structural, my retirement accounts, and any and all other holdings not previously specified. The total estimated value after taxes and bequests is approximately $4.2 million. Marigold made a noise like a kettle. Bennett finally looked up from his phone. My father said, "What?" I sat with my hands folded in my lap and I said nothing. My mother said, This can't be right. He had to have meant something different. We're his family." I looked at her. I looked at her for a long time. And then I said the thing I'd been writing in my green notebook, in different forms for almost 20 years. You weren't his family. You were the people who left an 11-year-old in a house with $300 and a key to the neighbors. You were the people who signed me away in a UPS box. You don't get to walk in here and call yourselves family just because there's money on the table. Family is who shows up. He showed up. You didn't. My father started to say something. Mavis cut him off in the kindest possible voice. "Mr. Holloway, the will is fully airtight. Your brother-in-law made his wishes extraordinarily clear, and any legal challenge will be dismissed at significant cost to the challenger. I'd strongly advise against it." Bennett was the first to leave. He muttered something about being late for a thing. Marigold cried theatrically and then followed him. My mother stood up slowly. "Hadley," she said, "I'm your mother." "You were," I said, "a long time ago." "For about 11 years. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. Then she walked out, and my father followed her, and the door clicked shut, and Mavis exhaled and slid the will across the table to me. "He wrote you a letter," she said. "He asked me to give it to you after." It was in his handwriting, not the careful blocky kind he used for important things, the looser kind, the kind he used for grocery lists, like he'd been sitting at his kitchen table when he wrote it. Hadley, by now you've heard the official version. Here's the real one. You weren't a project. You weren't a charity. You weren't a kid I took in because I felt sorry for you. You were the best thing that ever happened to a stubborn old bachelor who didn't know he had room for it. You don't owe me anything. Use the money to build something. Buy that house with Garrett. Have a kid or don't. Travel. Give some of it away. Pick a cause. You'll know the right one when you see it. And keep your feet up on the furniture. You earned the couch. Tea. I sat in that conference room for a long time after Mavis left. Then I drove back to the house in Briarcliff, the house that was mine now, and I sat on his couch and I put my feet up. Garrett came home that night and found me there. Otis was on the floor next to me. The lights were off. He didn't say anything. He just sat down next to me and put his arm around me, and we watched the dark for a while. A month later, I got a voicemail from my mother. She didn't apologize. She asked if there was anything you might be willing to share with your siblings. For the family. I didn't answer it. I didn't delete it either. I keep it on my phone the way some people keep an X-ray of an old broken bone. Not because it hurts, because it healed. That was 3 years ago. I'm 32 now. Garrett and I bought a smaller house down the street from Uncle Theo's. We couldn't bear to sell his place, so we rented out to a young teacher and her kid. I started the Theo Pierce Foundation last year. We give scholarships to middle children. Yes, specifically middle children. That's the only requirement. Your siblings have to exist on either side of you, who want to study engineering. It's a weird criterion. Uncle Theo would have loved it. I'm pregnant now, with our first. A girl. We're going to name her after Cordy. Cordelia Teresa Olsted. I think he'd like that. I think Cordy would have liked it too. The other day I was cleaning out the attic and I found my green notebook. I sat on the floor in the dust and read every page. There were 19 years of his sentences in there, in my handwriting, like I'd been transcribing the longest voicemail anyone ever left for anyone. Things exist to be used. The two kinds of people. The chair. You weren't the spare. I keep thinking about that little girl on the porch with the manila envelope. If I could go back there, I wouldn't tell her that everything was going to be okay, because everything wasn't, not for a long time. I'd just sit down next to her, the way he did, and I'd wait for the silver SUV to pull in. And I'd whisper to her, "He's coming, kid. Hold on. He's coming, and when he gets here, you're going to learn what it sounds like when somebody chooses you." That's the part nobody talks about, I think. Being chosen. Most people get it from the start. They get it from the people who made them. I had to wait 11 years and $300 and a key to the neighbors for mine. But I got it. I got it in full. 19 years worth, all the way to the last squeeze of his hand. And the rest of my life, every Sunday at 6, I still pick up the phone for a second. Just for a second. Just long enough to remember the sound of his voice saying, "Just calling to make sure you haven't joined a cult." Then I put it down and I keep my feet up and I keep writing my own chapter. I spent a long time turning the events of my life over in my hands like stones from a riverbed, trying to understand the shape of what happened to me. And here is what I keep coming back to. Every door that closed on me as a child opened a different one, and the door my parents shut behind them when they drove to Myrtle Beach was the same door my Uncle Theo walked through 6 days later. That isn't fate. That's the simple, almost mathematical truth that what we do to people ripples outward, and the ripples come back, sometimes in the form of strangers, sometimes in the form of judgment, sometimes in the form of a will reading on a Wednesday morning in a conference room you didn't expect to be sitting in. My parents made a choice when I was 11. They thought it was a small one. They thought middle children were durable, that I'd be fine, that I'd absorb the loss the way I'd absorb everything else. They didn't understand that small choices, repeated over a long enough timeline, become the entire architecture of who you are to someone. 19 years of small choices is a building, and when they walked into Mavis Doherty's office expecting an inheritance, they were really walking into the building they designed without realizing it. They just hadn't read the blueprints. What I learned from my uncle, the man who chose me when nobody asked him to, is that character is not a thing you say about yourself. It's a thing other people say about you when you aren't in the room. He never told me he was a good man. He just kept showing up on Sundays at 6 in plastic chairs at graduations and the doorway of my room reminding me to put my feet up. The integrity of his life was the daily unspectacular work of being where he said he'd be. That is what a moral life actually looks like, not grand gestures, just presence, repeated until it becomes a person. And I learned that intelligence isn't the same as cleverness. Cleverness is what my mother used to manipulate a moment. Intelligence is what my uncle used to build a life. He read me the way you read a book you intend to take seriously. He saw the chair I was afraid to sit in. He gave me a notebook for the things I didn't want to forget because he understood that wisdom isn't what you remember. It's what you write down before you can lose it. The strength I built late. I was 11 when the foundation cracked, and 32 when I stood in that conference room and used my voice without shaking. The years between were not some quick montage of healing. They were slow, dull, deliberate work. Strength is not the absence of being broken. It's what you do with the pieces afterward, day after day, until the cracks become the place the light comes in. So I keep my feet up on the couch. I write things down. I show up for the people who showed up for me. And when somebody comes looking for what they didn't earn, I remember that I am not obligated to give them an answer my uncle already gave them with his silence.